constable arrived within 20 minutes of Eleanor's call to the police, a man named Pritchard who had served Little Ashford for the better part of 2 decades and possessed the sort of calm, methodical demeanor that came from dealing with problems that rarely extended beyond missing livestock and the occasional break-in at the village shop. He was unprepared, Miss Marple observed, for what he found in the conservatory, and the slight pallor that crept across his features as he examined the body suggested that his experience, while respectable for a small village, had not encompassed murder. The dead woman was Margaret Ashton, confirmed by Eleanor, who had recovered sufficiently from her initial shock to provide the identification with a steadiness that suggested she was compartmentalizing her emotions with considerable discipline. Margaret lay among the ferns and potted orchids in a position that was awkward and entirely final. There was a wound to her left temple, dark and definitive, that had been inflicted by something heavy and blunt. Near her outstretched hand lay a bronze statue, a figure of Apollo that Eleanor identified as having stood on the conservatory shelf for many years. "We'll need to secure the scene," Pritchard said, speaking into his radio with the air of a man who was following procedures he had learned but never truly expected to have to employ. "I'm calling in Inspector Graves from the county. This is beyond my experience." The guests by this time had been politely but firmly asked to remain on the terrace, where they clustered in small, uncomfortable groups, speaking in lowered voices. The garden party, that emblem of civilized peace, had transformed into something resembling a theatrical production gone inexplicably wrong. The string quartet, having packed their instruments, stood to one side with expressions of bewildered dismay. The remains of the tea and sandwiches sat on their tables, beginning to assume the forlorn appearance that food acquires when no one is any longer inclined to consume it. Miss Marple found herself standing near David Hartwell, who was engaged in a rather tense conversation with James Ventnor. Their voices were low, but Miss Marple possessed the advantage of proximity and the sort of hearing that, while not what it had once been, remained quite serviceable when one applied oneself to the matter. "You knew her," David was saying, his tone somewhere between accusation and question. "I saw you, James. When you arrived and saw her here, your face told me perfectly well that you knew precisely who she was." "I did know her," James replied, his voice tight with something that might have been anger, or might have been fear, or might have been both in equal measure. "A long time ago, in India, but I had no idea she was here until I saw her on the lawn this afternoon." "And what was she to you?" David pressed. "Because whatever it was clearly enough to have caused you considerable upset." Before James could respond, Catherine appeared beside them with the sort of purposefulness that suggested she had been listening to their conversation and had decided that it had proceeded far enough without her intervention. "I should think," she said coolly, "that both of you might consider the wisdom of having this particular conversation when someone lies dead not 30 feet away, and the police are likely to question us all quite thoroughly in the near future. Whatever your private history with Miss Ashton, James, it will serve you rather poorly to have David speculating about it aloud where others might hear." James looked at Catherine with an expression of gratitude mixed with something else, a wariness that suggested he was being rescued from one difficulty only to be captured by another. Catherine, Miss Marple observed, had the sort of composure that only came from years of taking control of situations and people, and she deployed it now with the ease of long practice. Eleanor remained near the conservatory doors, speaking with Pritchard in a low voice. Miss Marple, moving quietly among the gathered guests under the pretense of observing the afternoon's fading light, positioned herself near enough to hear fragments of the conversation. "How long had she been employed here?" Pritchard was asking. 5 years, Eleanor said. "She was an excellent worker, quiet, competent, reliable. She lived in the cottage just beyond the eastern gate. It belonged to my late husband's estate. I know very little about her personal history. She kept to herself entirely." "Did she have family? Friends? Anyone who might have reason to wish her harm?" Eleanor shook her head slowly. I cannot imagine. She was the sort of person who was simply there. One did not think of her much, I'm afraid. But Miss Marple, who had taken the time to observe Margaret Ashton during the garden party, had thought of her a great deal. The woman had moved about the party with the sort of invisibility that servants often cultivated, present enough to be useful, absent enough to be overlooked. She had worn her hair pulled back severely, had dressed in a dark dress that seemed designed to render her unremarkable, and had positioned herself consistently at the edges of conversations rather than within them. Yet there had been something about Margaret Ashton that had caught Miss Marple's attention precisely because of that invisibility. There had been moments when her eyes had fixed on particular guests with an intensity that suggested observation of a rather purposeful kind. She had watched Eleanor with what might have been concern or might have been something far less benign. She had observed David with an expression that combined calculation with something rather like contempt. And when James Ventnor had arrived, Margaret Ashton had frozen entirely, had gone quite still, as though she had become a part of the garden statuary itself. It was only for a moment, but it had been a significant moment nonetheless. One did not react to the sudden appearance of an acquaintance with that particular combination of shock and recognition unless there was something considerably more complicated in one's history with that person than a casual friendship. Inspector Graves arrived as the afternoon was beginning its descent toward evening, a man of perhaps 50 with a methodical manner and the sort of eyes that suggested he missed very little. He surveyed the scene with the careful attention of someone trained to extract meaning from the physical world, then turned his attention to the assembled guests and staff. "I shall need statements from everyone present," he announced. "We'll conduct interviews in the house, beginning with the immediate family and the staff. In the meantime, no one is to leave Ashford Hall without my express permission." It was at that moment that Miss Marple chose to step forward, her manner so mild, so unthreatening, that the inspector scarcely seemed to notice her approach. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I wonder if I might offer a small observation. There is a matter of timing that may prove relevant to your investigation." Inspector Graves turned his attention to Miss Marple with the sort of polite skepticism that men in his position often extended to elderly women who fancied themselves amateur detectives. Yet there was something in his bearing that suggested he was not entirely dismissive, perhaps a recognition that village life had taught Miss Marple things that official channels might overlook. "And you are?" he inquired, his notebook already open. "Jane Marple. I've lived in the village for many years and was invited to the party as a guest of the Hartwells." She gestured toward the conservatory, with a gesture so subtle it might have passed unnoticed. "I happened to observe several things during the afternoon that may illuminate the question of when Miss Ashton met her death." The inspector's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Proceed, Miss Marple." "The garden party began at 2:30, Miss Marple continued in her gentle, unhurried manner. "Margaret Ashton was present throughout the first hour, serving refreshments. At approximately 3:30, I observed Mrs. Hartwell's reaction to something. She turned quite suddenly and looked toward the house with evident concern. This was followed a few minutes later by Mr. David Hartwell excusing himself and departing the lawn with considerable haste. When he returned, perhaps 10 minutes after that, his manner suggested agitation. Inspector Graves was taking notes now, his skepticism gradually replaced by something more akin to professional interest. "And what was your interpretation of these observations?" "Only that something had occurred within the house that caused disturbance to the family," Miss Marple said carefully. "What is more significant, however, is that I did not observe Margaret Ashton anywhere on the lawn following approximately 3 o'clock. She had been moving among the guests with the tea service until that time, but after the moment of Mrs. Hartwell's apparent distress, she vanished from sight." "She might have been attending to matters in the kitchen," Eleanor offered, stepping forward. "I did not track her movements precisely." "Perhaps," Miss Marple acknowledged, "but there is another matter. When I walked past the conservatory window at approximately 2:55, I distinctly observed the room through the glass. The statue that now lies beside Miss Ashton's body was, at that time, standing upon the shelf where Mrs. Hartwell indicated it belonged. The ferns in the far corner were positioned in a particular arrangement. I mention this only because it may assist in establishing a timeline. The inspector looked sharply from Miss Marple to the conservatory. "You're suggesting the crime occurred between 3 and 3:30? "I'm suggesting nothing," Miss Marple replied with careful precision. "I'm merely providing you with observations that may or may not prove relevant. The police are far more experienced than I in such matters." But the seeds had been planted, and Inspector Graves was a man who understood the value of meticulous timing. He turned to Pritchard with instructions to determine precisely when Eleanor had discovered the body, to establish what family members had been doing during the relevant period, and to question the household staff about their activities that afternoon. It was at this juncture that James Ventnor, who had been standing at the periphery of the conversation, made what would later be identified as a critical decision. He stepped forward with the air of a man who had been wrestling with a matter of conscience and had finally reached his resolution. "Inspector," he said, his voice steady despite the tension that radiated from his body, "I believe I must tell you something about Margaret Ashton. Her name was not always Ashton, and I did know her previously. It was 7 years ago, in India. She was Margaret Whitmore then, and she was employed as a companion to the wife of the colonial administrator where I was stationed." The assembled guests fell silent. Even Eleanor, who had moved to sit on one of the garden chairs, straightened with renewed attention. "There was an incident," James continued, his words carefully chosen. "Margaret Whitmore was accused of theft, a brooch belonging to my superior's wife. The matter was handled quietly, as such things were in those days. Margaret was dismissed from her position, and arrangements were made for her passage back to England. I had nothing to do with her subsequently, nor did I expect ever to encounter her again." "And yet you were shocked to see her here today," the inspector observed. "Extremely shocked," James admitted, "because the Margaret Whitmore I knew was not a thief. I'd always believed her to be innocent of the charge, though I said nothing at the time. My position would not have permitted me to contradict my superior's judgment. When I saw her here, it brought all of that back. The injustice of it, the knowledge that I had done nothing when I might have done something." Catherine, who had been listening intently, suddenly turned to look at James with an expression that combined several emotions: surprise, recalibration, and something that might have been a reassessment of her initial judgments. "So you're suggesting," the inspector said slowly, "that Margaret Ashton came to Little Ashford deliberately, that she was here for a reason connected to this matter in India?" "I have no idea why she came here," James said. "But yes, I believe she must have come with some purpose. A woman does not simply appear in a small English village at random." Eleanor had risen from her chair, and Miss Marple observed that her face had taken on a peculiar expression. Not shock, precisely, but something more like recognition. It was as though James's revelation had clarified something that had been troubling her, had provided a piece to a puzzle she had been attempting to assemble without fully understanding its shape. "My husband," Eleanor said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that suggested she had been waiting to speak these words, "was in India at precisely that time. He was on the Colonial Administration Board. He was involved in the investigation of that theft." The inspector's gaze moved from James to Eleanor, and Miss Marple, observing this exchange, felt the familiar sensation of pieces beginning to move into alignment, not yet forming a complete picture, but suggesting the outline of one. "Then it seems," Inspector Graves said, making a note in his book, "that we must explore what connections Margaret Ashton maintained to this household, and what business brought her to Ashford Hall 5 years ago, because whatever happened in India, it appears to have followed her here, and it appears, moreover, to have ended in her death." Inspector Graves, having issued his pronouncement, turned his attention to the practical matters of conducting a murder investigation. He arranged for the body to be removed by the county coroner's team, instructed Pritchard to begin taking formal statements from the household staff, and established a temporary operations base in Eleanor's drawing room. The guests who had not been directly connected to the household were dismissed after providing their names and addresses, though the inspector made clear that further questioning might be necessary. By the time the sun had begun its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Ashford Hall had assumed the peculiar atmosphere of a place that had been invaded by official machinery. Uniformed officers moved through corridors that had not known such intrusion in living memory. The drawing room, where Eleanor had once entertained guests for tea, had been transformed into something resembling a courtroom. Eleanor seated on one side of a table, the inspector across from her, with Pritchard stationed near the door taking notes. Miss Marple had been permitted to remain, ostensibly because she might provide relevant observations, though she suspected the inspector had also recognized that her presence seemed to have a calming effect on the household. She sat in a corner of the drawing room, her hands folded in her lap, appearing to the casual observer to be merely an elderly guest waiting for transportation home. In reality, she was conducting an investigation far more subtle than anything the official machinery could accomplish. Eleanor was being questioned about her late husband's involvement in the India matter. The inspector was thorough but not unkind, understanding perhaps that Eleanor was not a suspect but rather a witness to circumstances that had preceded her knowledge. Sir Geoffrey made inquiries into the theft, Eleanor explained, her voice steady but her hands betraying her anxiety by their constant, minute movements. It was a brooch, quite valuable, I understand. The woman who was accused, Margaret Whitmore, maintained her innocence, but the evidence seemed conclusive. She was dismissed and arrangements were made for her to return to England. And your husband never mentioned this matter to you after his return? The inspector asked. Eleanor hesitated, and in that hesitation, Miss Marple detected the presence of something unspoken, a confidence that had been kept, a secret maintained across years. It was the hesitation of a woman who was attempting to decide how much of her private life to reveal to official inquiry. He mentioned it once, Eleanor said at last. Some years after his return, he said that he had later come to believe Margaret Whitmore's protests of innocence. He said that the evidence, while it had appeared conclusive at the time, had been based entirely on circumstantial factors and the testimony of the colonial administrator's wife, who had always been a woman of questionable judgment. He regretted his role in the matter, though he believed that to attempt to correct it at such a distance would have been impossible. And did he express concern about meeting her again, if she had come to England? No, Eleanor said. He passed away 5 years ago, nearly to the month, in fact. I don't see how Margaret could have been here at the same time he was alive. But Miss Marple, who was observing Eleanor closely, noted the precision with which she had qualified her statement. Eleanor had said, "I don't see how," which was rather different from "she was not." It was a subtle distinction, but it was a distinction nonetheless. The inspector, however, seemed satisfied with the answer, or at least satisfied enough to move on to other matters. He inquired about Margaret Ashton's position in the household, her duties, her personal habits. Eleanor provided answers that were comprehensive but oddly distant. The answers of an employer discussing an employee one has never quite known. It was when the inspector asked about Margaret's relationship with the household members that Eleanor's composure showed its first genuine crack. She was professional, Eleanor said. She kept entirely to herself. I don't believe she had any particular relationship with David or Catherine. She was simply there. And yet she remained in your employ for 5 years, the inspector observed. That suggests a certain level of satisfaction on both sides. Yes, Eleanor agreed. She was reliable and competent. I saw no reason to dismiss her. After Eleanor had been excused, it was David's turn to be interviewed. He proved to be considerably less composed than his mother, his initial bravado gradually giving way to something more akin to genuine distress as the inspector's questions became more specific. "I barely knew the woman," David insisted, though his voice carried a defensive note that suggested the inspector had touched upon something more complicated. "She was staff. One doesn't typically form close relationships with staff. And yet you left the garden party quite hastily this afternoon," the inspector noted. "Approximately 30 minutes before the discovery of her body. Where were you during that time?" "I was in the study," David said quickly. "I received a telephone call from London regarding a business matter. A client was threatening to withdraw from a project I had initiated." "Can anyone verify this?" "The call was from my London office. They can confirm the time, though I don't recall the precise moment." The inspector made a note. "And you saw no one during your time inside the house? You encountered neither your mother nor the household staff?" "I saw my mother briefly," David amended. "She was in the hallway when I returned to the garden. We exchanged a few words, but nothing of significance." Miss Marple, observing David's face, noted that the color had risen slightly in his cheeks. Not the flush of guilt, precisely, but rather the flush of someone who was being deliberately evasive about something that he believed to be irrelevant but feared might be misinterpreted. It was at this point that Catherine requested an audience with the inspector. She had, she explained, been considering the afternoon's events and believed she possessed information that might be relevant to the investigation. The inspector agreed, dismissing David with instructions not to leave the premises. "I observed something this afternoon," Catherine began, once she had taken a seat across from the inspector, "that I initially attributed to Margaret's simple clumsiness. But in light of her death, I believe it may be more significant." "Please elaborate," the inspector said, his pen poised above his notebook. "At approximately 2:45, I was near the conservatory, observing the arrangement of plants. Margaret passed through the room. She was meant to be organizing the ice service for the afternoon refreshments. She stumbled quite badly near the far corner, nearly knocking over one of the ferns. She appeared to have been startled by something, though when I asked if she was well, she simply apologized and continued on her way." "Did you observe what might have startled her?" "I did not notice anything at the time," Catherine said, "but now I wonder if perhaps someone had been in the conservatory at that moment. Someone Margaret was not expecting to encounter." The inspector's eyes sharpened. "Someone like whom?" Catherine paused, and in that pause Miss Marple felt the investigation shift once more, felt the momentum build toward a revelation that would clarify the morning's darkness. Catherine took a measured breath, her composure reflecting years of navigating complicated family dynamics with precision and restraint. "I believe it may have been James Ventnor," she said carefully, "though I cannot be entirely certain. I know only that when I asked Margaret if she required assistance, she seemed anxious to leave the conservatory, and James had stepped away from the garden party at approximately that same time. I noticed his absence when I was looking for him to discuss the music arrangement for later in the evening." The inspector made a note, his expression betraying nothing. "You're suggesting that Mr. Ventnor and Miss Ashton met in the conservatory prior to the official discovery of her body?" "I'm suggesting it as a possibility," Catherine clarified. "I cannot say what transpired between them, or even that they necessarily encountered one another, but the timing is curious, and Margaret's behavior afterward was unusual enough that I thought it warranted mention." "And you did not think to mention this to anyone at the time?" "I thought it was simply Margaret being clumsy," Catherine replied, and Miss Marple detected in her voice a note of genuine regret. "I could not have anticipated that she would be dead within the hour. If I had known, I would have questioned her more thoroughly." After Catherine had been dismissed, the inspector sat in thoughtful silence for a long moment, his pen tapping slowly against his notebook. It was clear that the investigation had reached a point where multiple threads had begun to converge, and the challenge now lay in determining which threads were genuinely connected and which were merely coincidental intersections of circumstance. "Miss Marple," the inspector said at last, turning his attention to the elderly woman in the corner. "You have been remarkably quiet for someone who seems possessed of considerable observational capacity. I wonder if you have formed any conclusions about this afternoon's events." Miss Marple arranged her expression into one of gentle uncertainty. "I should be hesitant to form conclusions when the facts are still so incomplete," she said. "However, if you will permit me to observe that what appears most evident on the surface is often concealing something rather more complicated beneath. Such as? Consider the matter from a logical perspective," Miss Marple suggested. Margaret Ashton was an invisible woman, someone whom the household did not truly know, whom the village accepted without curiosity. Yet she came to Little Ashford for a reason. That reason must have been connected to the Hartwell family. The question is not whether she came with purpose, but what that purpose was. "You believe she came with intent to harm someone?" "I believe," Miss Marple said carefully, "that people rarely appear in small villages without reason. They come seeking something: employment, shelter, anonymity. Sometimes they come seeking revenge. The challenge lies in determining which of these applied to Miss Ashton." The inspector considered this. "And based on your observations, what is your assessment?" "I think," Miss Marple said, choosing her words with deliberate care, "that Miss Ashton came to Little Ashford knowing that someone in this household had wronged her. Whether she came intending to exact revenge or merely to observe those who had wronged her remained unclear until her death occurred. But her death suggests that someone in this household either feared what she might do or feared what she knew." Before the inspector could respond, Pritchard appeared at the drawing-room door with news that James Ventnor had requested a private interview with the inspector. When James entered moments later, his appearance had changed noticeably from the composed figure who had arrived at the garden party earlier in the afternoon. His hair was slightly disheveled, his shirt collar loosened, and there was about him an air of barely restrained tension. "I need to tell you the complete truth about Margaret," James said without preamble. "It's more complicated than what I said earlier." The inspector gestured for James to sit. "Please proceed." "Margaret Whitmore was innocent of the theft," James began. "I knew it then, and I know it now. The brooch belonged to the colonial administrator's wife, but she did not misplace it. She deliberately hid it and then accused Margaret of stealing it." "Why would she do that?" "Because her husband had been paying inappropriate attention to Margaret," James said, and the words seemed to cost him considerable effort to articulate. Margaret had rejected his advances quite firmly. His wife, in retaliation, concocted the theft accusation as a means of removing Margaret from the household. It was cruel and effective. "And you know this how?" "Because I witnessed part of an argument between the administrator and his wife where she admitted as much," James said. "She was furious with her husband's behavior and used the false accusation as a form of punishment. When I realized what had occurred, it was too late. Margaret had already been dismissed, and arrangements had been made for her return to England. I should have spoken up at that time, but I was young and my career was important to me, and I was afraid of the consequences of contradicting my superior." The inspector was taking careful notes. "And when you saw Margaret here today, did you attempt to speak with her?" James hesitated, and in that hesitation lay the critical moment that would either corroborate or contradict Catherine's observation. "I did attempt to speak with her," he admitted. "After I arrived at the party, I saw her near the conservatory. I went to her, and we had a brief conversation." "The contents of which were?" "I apologized," James said simply, "for not having defended her when I could have, for not having attempted to clear her name. I told her I had come to believe her innocent and that I regretted my silence." "And how did she respond?" "She was initially shocked to see me," James said. "Then she seemed almost relieved. She told me that she had always wondered whether I had believed her and that my words meant more to her than I could imagine. She said that coming to Little Ashford had been about confronting her past, about understanding who had truly wronged her. She said she had thought it was about revenge, but she realized it was about understanding." "And then?" "And then we parted," James said. She said she needed to think about what I had told her. I returned to the garden party. That was the last time I saw her alive." Miss Marple, listening to this account, found herself observing James with particular attention. His words had the ring of truth to them, yet there remained something unsaid, a detail he was withholding, perhaps not from the inspector but from himself. It was the sort of incomplete truth that often preceded a more significant revelation. The inspector regarded James with the careful attention of a man who had learned, through years of experience, that partial truths often revealed themselves through the spaces between words. "Mr. Ventnor, I have the sense that you are being forthright with me. Yet I also have the sense that there is something you have omitted from your account. I would strongly advise you to consider the wisdom of complete honesty at this juncture." James' jaw tightened, and he looked away toward the window, where the last light of day was fading from the sky. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, stripped of the careful composure he had been maintaining. "Margaret told me something else," he said, "something that she said she had discovered since coming to Little Ashford. She said that the administrator's wife, her name was Catherine Ashford then, before she married, had not acted alone in the theft accusation. She said that someone else had been involved in the conspiracy, someone who benefited from Margaret's dismissal." The drawing room seemed to contract around this revelation. Miss Marple, who had maintained her pose of gentle irrelevance, felt her pulse quicken imperceptibly. Catherine Ashford. Catherine Hartwell. Did Miss Ashton specify who this person was? The inspector asked, though his voice suggested he already suspected the answer. "She said she had been attempting to verify it," James replied. "She said she had found documents, old letters, correspondence that suggested the involvement of Sir Geoffrey Hartwell, Eleanor's late husband. She said that at the time of the theft accusation, Geoffrey Hartwell had been attempting to secure a lucrative contract with the colonial administrator. The contract would have been worth considerable money to the Hartwell estate. She believed that he had encouraged the administrator's wife to make the false accusation as a means of removing Margaret from the household and thereby securing the administrator's goodwill." The inspector set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. "And you are only now revealing this information?" "Because I am not certain it is true," James said defensively. "Margaret said she was still attempting to verify it. She said she had hired a solicitor to investigate the matter, to determine whether there was any legal recourse available to her. She seemed more interested in understanding the truth than in exacting revenge. Yet someone killed her this afternoon," the inspector observed. "Someone who apparently feared what she might discover or reveal." It was at this moment that Pritchard appeared once more at the drawing-room door, his expression suggesting he had information of significance. He handed the inspector a sealed envelope, which the inspector opened and examined. His expression did not change, but Miss Marple observed the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated the contents were noteworthy. "We have discovered correspondence in Miss Ashton's cottage," the inspector said, addressing the room at large. "Letters from a solicitor in London regarding an investigation into events that occurred in India approximately 7 years ago. The letters indicate that Miss Ashton had indeed hired legal counsel to investigate the matter of her dismissal and the allegations of theft. The most recent letter, dated 3 weeks ago, indicates that the solicitor had uncovered evidence suggesting that Sir Geoffrey Hartwell had indeed been complicit in the conspiracy against her." James closed his eyes briefly, as though the confirmation of what Margaret had told him caused him considerable distress. "She was going to do something with this information," he said quietly. "She didn't tell me specifically what, but she seemed resolved about it." "And did you provide her with any assistance in this matter?" "No," James said firmly. "I only apologized for my past failure to assist her. I did not discuss her plans further." The inspector dismissed James with instructions to remain available for further questioning. Once he had departed, the inspector turned his attention to Miss Marple, who had observed the entire exchange with her customary air of gentle contemplation. I suspect, Miss Marple, that you are beginning to form a more complete picture of this matter than I am, the inspector said. You have been remarkably quiet for someone possessed of such observational capacity. What conclusions have you reached? Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair, moving to the window to observe the darkening landscape beyond. I think, she said carefully, that this murder did not occur as a result of a sudden passion or an unplanned moment of violence. I think it occurred because someone in this household discovered what Margaret Ashton had learned and feared the consequences of that discovery becoming public knowledge. Eleanor, the inspector suggested. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, though I think it more likely that Eleanor was unaware of her late husband's involvement in the matter. Sir Geoffrey maintained his own counsel about such things, I suspect, which leaves us with the question of who discovered Margaret's investigation and felt sufficiently threatened to take action. David? The inspector asked. David is a man who conceals weakness behind charm, Miss Marple observed. He is someone who has never had to face serious consequences for his actions. But I do not think David is our murderer. Then who? Miss Marple turned from the window to face the inspector directly. I think the answer lies in understanding what Margaret Ashton discovered about the connection between the India incident and events here at Ashford Hall. I think the answer requires us to determine not only what Sir Geoffrey did, but why he did it and who benefited from his actions. Because murder, Inspector, is rarely about a single incident. It is usually about the layers of secrets and complications that accumulate around that incident over time. The inspector regarded Miss Marple with an expression that combined respect with frustration. You are suggesting that I must dig deeper into the Hartwell family's financial history? I'm suggesting, Miss Marple said gently, that a woman does not remain in a household for 5 years, living in poverty and obscurity, unless she is searching for something specific. And I'm suggesting that once she found what she was searching for, someone in this household moved to prevent her from revealing it. The question now is who among the Hartwells felt most threatened by Margaret's discoveries. The inspector, taking Miss Marple's suggestion to heart, spent the next several hours examining the financial records that Eleanor had reluctantly provided from her late husband's papers. Pritchard, meanwhile, was dispatched to contact the solicitor in London who had conducted the investigation into the India matter on Margaret's behalf. It was nearly midnight when the results of these inquiries began to coalesce into something resembling coherence. The solicitor's report, when transmitted to the inspector via telephone, revealed that Sir Geoffrey Hartwell had indeed been instrumental in the false theft accusation. More significantly, it revealed his motive. At the time of the incident, the colonial administrator had possessed the power to grant or withhold a lucrative contract for railway expansion. Geoffrey Hartwell's firm had been bidding against several competitors for the contract, and the administrator's favor would have been decisive. By encouraging his wife to make the false accusation against Margaret, Geoffrey had secured the administrator's gratitude and, more importantly, his business alliance. The contract had been awarded to Hartwell's firm, and the profits from that contract had been substantial. Substantial enough to have funded several significant improvements to the Hartwell estate and to have established the financial foundation for the family's prosperity in the years that followed. In other words, the inspector said to Miss Marple as he relayed this information, Sir Geoffrey's willingness to destroy a young woman's reputation and livelihood was the direct cause of the Hartwell family's financial security and social standing. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, which raises an interesting question regarding motivation for murder. If Margaret Ashton had chosen to pursue legal action or to make her situation public, what would have been the consequence? The inspector considered this. If the matter became public, it would have damaged the Hartwell family's reputation considerably. 18 months after Sir Geoffrey's death, Eleanor would have faced considerable social disgrace. David's business interests might have suffered. Catherine's professional reputation might have been compromised. Indeed, Miss Marple said. And yet, Inspector, there is another dimension to consider. What if the consequence of Margaret's revelations extended beyond mere social disgrace? What if there were legal or financial implications as well? This question prompted another examination of the records, and it was Eleanor herself who ultimately provided the crucial information. When the inspector returned to question her further about her husband's financial affairs, Eleanor revealed, with considerable reluctance, that Sir Geoffrey had made a provision in his will regarding Margaret Ashton, a provision that Eleanor had long forgotten, as it had been written in an addendum to the original will that Sir Geoffrey had kept private. "There is an annuity," Eleanor explained, her voice hollow with the weight of this revelation. A modest one, but provided to Margaret Ashton in perpetuity. Geoffrey provided for her, financially, though he never explained why. I honored the provision after his death, but I never questioned its existence. I assumed it was some charitable impulse on his part. The inspector's eyes sharpened. "Did you make payments to Miss Ashton?" "No," Eleanor said. "The funds were transferred through a solicitor in London as part of the management of Sir Geoffrey's estate. I provided the authorization for the payments, but I never had direct contact with Miss Ashton regarding the matter." "And what was the amount of these annuity payments?" Eleanor provided the figure, and it was enough to suggest that Sir Geoffrey, while perhaps not entirely purging his conscience regarding Margaret's dismissal, had at least attempted to provide her with a measure of financial security. It was enough, Miss Marple reflected, to keep a woman alive, but perhaps not quite enough to keep her living with dignity in the world that had rejected her. The revelation of the annuity altered the investigation's trajectory considerably. If Margaret had been receiving payments from the Hartwell estate, she would have been in contact with Eleanor's solicitors, would have been aware of her connection to the Hartwell family's continued prosperity. She would have understood, in other words, that her financial survival had been purchased with the proceeds of her own destruction. It was at this juncture that Miss Marple requested a private conversation with Eleanor, away from the inspector's formal interrogation. The two women sat together in Eleanor's private study, a room lined with books and furnished with the sort of understated elegance that spoke of considerable cultivation. "I think you have been very brave, Mrs. Hartwell," Miss Marple said gently. "Discovering that your late husband was capable of such deception, and discovering it in such public circumstances, cannot have been pleasant." Eleanor's composure, which had been maintained throughout the inspector's questioning, began to crack. "I believed in Geoffrey," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I believed in his integrity, his sense of honor, to learn that he was willing to ruin an innocent woman for a business contract. People are rarely what we believe them to be," Miss Marple observed. "We see in them what we wish to see, and we remain blind to what we fear to acknowledge. Your husband was capable of both great kindness and considerable cruelty. The annuity suggests that at some point he recognized the harm he had caused. Whether that recognition brought him peace or merely added to his burden, we cannot know." "Do you believe I had something to do with Margaret's death?" Eleanor asked, and the question was asked with such directness that Miss Marple recognized Eleanor as a woman who preferred truth to comfortable deception. "No," Miss Marple said simply. "I believe you are a woman who has discovered uncomfortable truths about her husband and her family, and who is struggling to reconcile those truths with the person she believed herself to be. But I do not believe you are a murderer. The person who killed Margaret acted from fear and from a desperate desire to protect something they believed to be more important than Margaret's life. You have already demonstrated your capacity to confront uncomfortable truths, even when doing so brings you considerable pain. A murderer would have chosen evasion." Eleanor looked at Miss Marple with an expression of gratitude mixed with despair. "Then who, Miss Marple? Who in my family was so desperate to protect themselves that they would resort to murder?" Miss Marple rose from her chair and moved to the window, where the night pressed against the glass with the weight of accumulated secrets. When she spoke, her voice carried the certainty of someone who had spent decades observing the patterns of human behavior and had learned to read them with the precision of a scholar reading ancient text. "The answer lies in understanding what each member of your family stood to lose," Miss Marple said. "David's business interests are considerable, but they are also precarious. I've observed that men of his temperament often operate on the assumption that appearance is more important than substance. If his family's reputation were damaged, if questions were raised about the foundation upon which the Hartwell fortune was built, his creditors might become nervous. His clients might seek other representation. His charm would serve him less effectively if he were known to be the son of a man who had conspired to destroy an innocent woman's livelihood. Eleanor listened intently, her hands gripping the arms of her chair with white-knuckled intensity. Catherine, however, Miss Marple continued, operates in a world where integrity and trustworthiness are essential to professional success. She has built a reputation as a woman of principle, someone whose judgment about matters of design and aesthetics is guided by an ethical framework as much as by aesthetic sensibility. If it were known that she is the daughter of a man who committed such a betrayal, if it were known that her family's wealth was built upon such foundations, her professional standing would be compromised. She would be seen not as a woman of principle, but as a woman whose principles are merely a facade covering a legacy of moral compromise. Eleanor's face had gone pale. "You are suggesting that Catherine—" "I am suggesting," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "that we must examine the timeline of events more carefully. Catherine was present at the garden party. Catherine was the one who observed Margaret's apparent distress in the conservatory at approximately 2:45. Catherine was also the one who informed the inspector of this observation, thereby providing herself with an alibi by demonstrating her willingness to provide evidence against herself." "But that proves her innocence," Eleanor protested. "It proves only," Miss Marple replied, "that Catherine is a woman of considerable intelligence. An innocent person who had observed something suspicious would report it. A guilty person who wished to establish her innocence while simultaneously establishing reasonable suspicion against another would also report it, thereby appearing forthright while actually directing suspicion toward James Ventnor." Eleanor rose abruptly from her chair, her distress evident in the jerky, agitated movements that replaced her usual composure. "This is absurd. Catherine would never—" "Catherine would never what?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Never harm someone. Never act to protect her own interests. Never do something she believed to be necessary in order to preserve the life she had constructed with such care." Before Eleanor could respond, there came a knock at the study door. The inspector entered, accompanied by Pritchard, and his expression suggested that he had been conducting his own line of investigation with considerable success. "We have made a discovery," the inspector announced. "Miss Ashton's solicitor in London has provided us with copies of all correspondence regarding her investigation into the India matter. In her most recent letter to the solicitor, dated 2 days ago, Miss Ashton indicated that she had located someone in Little Ashford who possessed documentary evidence regarding her father's involvement in the conspiracy against her." Eleanor's breath caught audibly. "Moreover," the inspector continued, "we have discovered that Catherine Hartwell visited Miss Ashton's cottage on 3 separate occasions over the past month. The visits are documented by the landlord, who noted that Miss Hartwell appeared agitated on each occasion and spent considerable time in private conversation with Miss Ashton." "Catherine came to see her?" Eleanor whispered. "Yes," the inspector said. "And what is particularly interesting is that on the day of the garden party, Catherine made a telephone call from the house at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon. The call was to Miss Ashton's cottage. The landlord, who was present when the call came through, reports that Miss Ashton seemed disturbed by the call and indicated that she needed to speak with someone at Ashford Hall immediately." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, and Eleanor observed the subtle shift in her expression that suggested the final pieces had moved into alignment. "Catherine asked Margaret to come to the house," Miss Marple said quietly. "She asked her to come to the conservatory, where they could speak privately, away from the garden party. Catherine told Margaret that she had documents to provide her, evidence that would support Margaret's claims regarding Sir Geoffrey's involvement in the conspiracy." "But why would Catherine do that?" Eleanor asked, confusion and desperation mingling in her voice. Because, Miss Marple replied, Catherine had discovered her father's papers regarding the India matter. She had read them. She had understood for the first time the truth about the foundation upon which her family's prosperity rested. And she had come to the realization that she could not live with that knowledge, could not continue to build a professional reputation based on principles of integrity while that knowledge remained her private shame. So she killed Margaret? Eleanor breathed the words rather than spoke them. Catherine went to the conservatory with the intention of providing Margaret with the documents, Miss Marple said. But in conversation, Margaret revealed something that Catherine had not anticipated. Margaret had decided not to pursue legal action. Margaret had decided that vengeance and exposure would not bring her peace, would not restore what had been taken from her. Margaret had decided to let the matter rest, to accept the annuity her father had provided, and to live out her life quietly. The inspector was following this narrative with careful attention, his notebook forgotten in his pocket. And when Catherine realized that Margaret intended to remain silent, Miss Marple continued, Catherine understood that her sacrifice, the moral anguish she had endured in preparing to expose her family's shame, would be unnecessary. And in that moment, Catherine's fragile composure fractured. She reached for the statue. She acted not with premeditation, but with the desperate impulse of someone who could not bear to have her self-sacrifice rendered meaningless. Eleanor sank back into her chair, her face in her hands. The inspector remained silent for a long moment, allowing Miss Marple's narrative to settle into the space between them like sediment in still water. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who had spent years pursuing truth through official channels and had rarely encountered it articulated with such clarity and precision. "You are speaking with considerable certainty, Miss Marple," he said. "Yet we have only circumstantial evidence. We would require a confession or physical evidence that conclusively links Miss Catherine Hartwell to the murder." "Of course," Miss Marple acknowledged, "which is why I suspect you have already begun examining the conservatory more thoroughly. The bronze statue, I imagine, has been tested for fingerprints. The floor has been examined for traces of fabric or other identifying material, and you have, I further suspect, discovered something that connects Catherine to the scene." The inspector exchanged a glance with Pritchard, and it was clear to Miss Marple that her deductions had once again proven accurate. Pritchard produced a small evidence bag from his pocket, within which lay a fragment of fabric, a piece of dark blue material that appeared to have been torn from a larger garment. "We found this caught on the edge of the conservatory shelf," the inspector said. "It matches the dress Miss Catherine was wearing this afternoon. She would have had difficulty explaining its presence without acknowledging that she had been in close contact with the statue." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Catherine's dress was torn when she struck the blow," she said quietly. She would not have noticed immediately, engaged as she was in the overwhelming shock of what she had just done. It was only later, as she composed herself and prepared to rejoin the garden party, that she would have realized the damage. But by then, it was too late to do anything about it. Eleanor made a sound from her chair, something between a sob and a gasp. "My daughter," she whispered. "My own daughter." The inspector turned toward the door. "I shall need to question Miss Catherine again. This time I shall present her with the physical evidence and give her the opportunity to provide an account of her actions. Often, when confronted with such evidence, individuals choose to speak truthfully rather than maintain deception." But before he could exit the study, there came the sound of raised voices from elsewhere in the house, a commotion that suggested something unexpected had occurred. Pritchard moved quickly toward the door, and the inspector followed close behind. Miss Marple, despite her years and the late hour, rose and moved after them with determined purpose. In the hallway, they found David attempting to prevent Catherine from ascending the main staircase. Catherine's face was flushed, her composure entirely abandoned, and she was struggling against her brother's grip with a desperation that transcended ordinary physical resistance. "Let me go," she was saying, her voice raw with emotion. "I cannot bear this. I cannot bear any more of this." "Catherine, you must remain calm," David was saying, but his voice carried more uncertainty than reassurance. "The inspector wishes to speak with you again. You must simply tell him the truth and everything will be resolved." "The truth?" Catherine laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "The truth is that I have spent my entire life attempting to build something of integrity, something that was not built upon lies and betrayal and the destruction of innocent people. And just when I thought I might finally be able to do something meaningful with that knowledge, to actually attempt to make amends for my family's sins, She did not complete the sentence. Instead, she broke free from David's grip with a sudden convulsive movement and turned to face the inspector directly. "I killed her," Catherine said, and the words seemed to pour out of her with the force of a dam breaking. "I killed Margaret Ashton. I did not intend to, or perhaps I did intend to. I no longer know what I intended. I only know that I am responsible for her death, and I will not have my brother or my mother or anyone else attempt to protect me from the consequences of that action." The inspector moved forward carefully, as one approaches a wounded animal that might either flee or become more aggressive. "Miss Catherine, I must advise you that anything you say may be used as evidence against you. You have the right to legal representation before making any further statements." "I do not require legal representation," Catherine said with a terrible clarity. "I require only that you understand precisely what occurred and why. I require that the truth be documented and acknowledged. I require that my father's sins and my own complicity in perpetuating those sins be recorded for posterity." She allowed herself to be led downstairs to the drawing room, where the inspector formally cautioned her regarding her rights and arranged for a police constable to be present as witness. Miss Marple and Eleanor were asked to remain in the adjoining room, from which they could observe through the partially open door, but could not be present in the formal interrogation. Catherine's confession, when it came, was thorough and devastating in its honesty. She described discovering her father's papers relating to the India matter approximately 1 month prior. She described reading his correspondence with the colonial administrator, understanding for the first time the calculated cruelty with which her father had orchestrated Margaret's dismissal. She described the shock of recognizing that her family's prosperity, her own education, her very existence as a woman of means and status was built upon such a foundation. "I spent weeks in turmoil," Catherine explained, her voice steady despite the tears that tracked down her face. "I could not eat. I could not sleep. I could not work. I knew that I had to do something, had to make some sort of restitution. When I discovered that Margaret Ashton was here, living in obscurity on the periphery of my family's world, I understood that some form of justice might be possible." She described her visits to Margaret's cottage, her attempts to convince Margaret that together they might expose what Sir Geoffrey had done. She described Margaret's gradual revelation that she had no interest in revenge or exposure, that she had come to Little Ashford simply to understand her own history, and having understood it, wished only to be left in peace. "I told her I had something for her," Catherine continued. "I told her to meet me in the conservatory during the garden party, where we could speak without disturbance. I told her I would provide her with the original documents, proof of what my father had done. I thought that having this documentation would give her the power to act, if she chose to do so. And when she refused to take action," the inspector prompted gently. Catherine's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. She said that exposure would not bring her back what had been lost. She said that revenge would not heal her wounds. She said that she had made peace with her past and wished only to live quietly. And I... Catherine's composure fractured entirely, and she buried her face in her hands. I could not bear that. I could not bear that my sacrifice, my willingness to destroy my own family's reputation in the name of justice, would be rendered meaningless by her refusal to participate in it. I reached for the statue in a moment of absolute fury and despair, and I struck her. I did not think. I only acted. The confession continued for another hour, detailing the horror of Catherine's realization of what she had done, her panic, her decision to rejoin the garden party and maintain composure until someone discovered the body. It was a confession that was, in its completeness and its evident anguish, utterly convincing. As Miss Marple listened from the adjoining room, she felt the weight of human complexity descend upon her like a physical force. Catherine had killed Margaret not out of hatred or greed, but out of a twisted sense of justice, out of a desperate desire to make meaning from her father's crimes by forcing action upon someone who had already chosen peace. It was a murder born not of malice, but of the collision between idealism and reality, between the desire to transform the world and the world's stubborn refusal to cooperate with such transformation. The formal proceedings that followed Catherine's arrest proceeded with the methodical precision that characterized the English legal system. She was taken into custody, her rights explained to her, and arrangements were made for her to be represented by a solicitor from the county town. The house fell into a peculiar silence in the hours after her departure, a silence that seemed to extend far beyond the mere absence of voices and into something more profound, a silence born of the collision between one's understanding of the world and the revelation that the world was considerably more complicated than one had believed. Eleanor remained in her study, the room becoming a place of quiet refuge where she attempted to process the cascading revelations that had transformed her family's identity in the space of a single afternoon. Miss Marple sat with her as evening gave way to night, and night began its slow progression toward dawn. They spoke very little, but the silence between them was companionable rather than strained, the silence of two women who understood that some things could not be adequately expressed in language and should therefore be allowed to simply exist. "I failed her," Eleanor said at last, breaking the silence that had persisted for nearly an hour. "Catherine, I mean. I failed to see what was happening within her. I failed to recognize the depth of her distress." "You could not have known," Miss Marple replied gently. "Catherine is a woman who was trained from childhood to conceal her emotions, to present a face of competence and composure to the world. She was extremely skilled at that concealment. It would have required someone with extraordinary insight into her character to have recognized the crisis beneath her surface." "You recognized it," Eleanor observed. "I'm an old woman who has spent considerably more time observing humanity than most," Miss Marple said, "and I recognized only what Catherine herself made visible through her actions. I did not comprehend the full depths of her crisis until it had expressed itself in violence. Had I been more perceptive, had I understood her suffering more completely, I might have intervened before tragedy occurred." Eleanor turned to look at Miss Marple directly. "Do you blame yourself for Margaret's death?" Miss Marple considered this question with the careful deliberation it deserved. "I blame myself for not having acted more decisively when I first observed evidence of Catherine's distress. But I do not blame myself for Catherine's choice to kill Margaret. That choice was Catherine's own, made in a moment when her emotional state had become so precarious that reason could not operate. One can sympathize with the circumstances that led to that moment without absolving oneself of responsibility for having failed to prevent it." It was in this conversation that Miss Marple made a decision that would, in later years, be discussed in the village with considerable debate. She requested an interview with the inspector, and when that interview was granted, she presented him with an observation that caused him to regard her with something between gratitude and concern. "I have been reflecting upon the events of this afternoon," Miss Marple said carefully, "and I have concluded that there are certain details that, while they do not alter the fundamental facts of the case, may be relevant to how those facts are presented to the court and how Catherine's actions are understood by the legal system." "Such as?" the inspector asked, his pen poised above his notebook. "Such as the matter of Catherine's psychological state prior to the murder," Miss Marple replied. I do not speak as an expert in such matters, but I have observed individuals experiencing mental distress for many years. Catherine exhibited several indicators that suggested she was not operating in a state of full, rational consciousness. She was experiencing what I might characterize as a dissociative episode, a separation between her intellectual understanding of events and her emotional capacity to manage those events. Are you suggesting that she was insane? I am suggesting, Miss Marple said carefully, that she was extremely distressed and that her capacity for rational judgment had been significantly compromised. Whether that constitutes insanity in the legal sense is a matter for medical experts and for the courts to determine. But I believe that if Catherine's solicitor were made aware of these observations, they might seek expert psychiatric evaluation, which could be relevant to her defense. The inspector regarded Miss Marple with an expression of complex emotion, admiration mixed with frustration. You are attempting to ensure that she receives a fair trial rather than simply a conviction. I am attempting to ensure that the truth is fully documented, Miss Marple corrected gently. The truth includes not only what Catherine did, but also the circumstances and her mental state when she did it. The legal system is designed to account for such nuances. It would be a disservice to that system and to justice itself to present Catherine's actions as those of a coldly calculating murderer when the evidence suggests something considerably more tragic. The inspector made notes, though his expression suggested ambivalence about Miss Marple's suggestion. Yet within days, Catherine's solicitor had indeed engaged a psychiatric expert to evaluate her condition. That expert's assessment concluded that Catherine had been experiencing a severe depressive episode, combined with what might be characterized as acute moral crisis, a state of mind that, while not negating responsibility for her actions, was significant in understanding the psychological context in which those actions had occurred. The trial, when it occurred 3 months later in the county courthouse, was a matter of considerable public interest. The newspapers featured extensive coverage of the case, with particular emphasis on the dramatic revelation that a woman of Catherine's social standing and professional reputation had committed murder. The sensation was tempered somewhat by the psychiatric evidence, which suggested that Catherine had not been a calculating murderer, but rather a deeply troubled woman whose moral sensibilities had been shattered by the discovery of her family's betrayal. Catherine was convicted of manslaughter rather than murder, a distinction that reflected the court's judgment that while she was responsible for Margaret's death, the circumstances and her mental state were relevant to assessing the nature of her culpability. She received a sentence of 12 years' imprisonment, which, while substantial, was considerably less severe than what would have been imposed for murder. Eleanor attended each day of the trial, sitting in the gallery with an expression of profound sadness and resignation. David attended occasionally, but seemed unable to maintain composure for extended periods. Miss Marple attended as well, observing the proceedings with her customary attentiveness, speaking to no one unless directly addressed, yet somehow conveying through her mere presence an understanding of the complexities involved. On the final day of the trial, after the verdict had been rendered and Catherine had been remanded into custody pending sentencing, Eleanor approached Miss Marple in the hallway outside the courtroom. "I want to thank you," Eleanor said, "for your role in ensuring that the truth was fully understood, for your suggestion that Catherine's mental state be evaluated, for treating my daughter with the dignity and compassion that she deserved despite what she had done." Miss Marple took Eleanor's hand gently. "Your daughter committed a terrible act," she said quietly. "But she was also a victim of her father's moral compromise, a victim of her own idealism meeting brutal reality, a victim of the collision between her desire to make meaning and her inability to control the consequences of that desire. Understanding those things does not erase what she did, but it ensures that we understand not only her guilt, but also her suffering." Eleanor nodded slowly, and the two women stood together for a moment in companionable silence, united in their understanding that human behavior could rarely be reduced to simple categories of right and wrong, guilt and innocence. The autumn came to Little Ashford with the sort of quiet inevitability that characterized the changing of seasons in the English countryside. The leaves turned gold and then brown, drifting down from the trees to form layers of decomposing color on the ground. The days grew shorter, and the nights descended with increasing totality, as though the earth itself was preparing for a long sleep. Life in the village resumed its ordinary patterns, though there remained about the place an undercurrent of unease, a collective understanding that the facade of peaceful predictability had been revealed as precisely that, a facade masking considerably darker realities. Ashford Hall stood quiet and diminished in the autumn light. Eleanor had closed many of the rooms, reducing the household to its essential spaces. The conservatory, where Margaret Ashton had met her death, remained empty. Eleanor had been unable to bring herself to use the space after the tragedy, and it had gradually assumed the character of a tomb, filled with dust and the withered remains of plants that no one tended. It was on a grey afternoon in late October, nearly 6 months after the events of the garden party, that Miss Marple received a visitor. James Ventnor appeared at her cottage door with an air of deliberate purpose, and when she invited him inside, he accepted with evident gratitude for the opportunity to speak in private. "I'm returning to India," he announced, once they had settled in her sitting room with tea between them. "I've accepted a position with an educational institution there. I will be teaching history and philosophy to young men preparing for careers in the civil service." "How excellent," Miss Marple said, observing him carefully over the rim of her teacup. "And what prompts this decision?" James was silent for a long moment, and Miss Marple understood that he was wrestling with the question of how much truth to reveal. Finally, he spoke. "I've come to understand that my presence here is a constant reminder to those who are affected by the tragedy. Eleanor cannot look at me without being reminded of Margaret and of the connection between my past and the events that led to her death. David is resentful that I did not emerge from the investigation as a suspect, as though my exoneration somehow reflects poorly upon him, and the village, while polite on the surface, has never quite accepted that I was innocent of involvement." "And are you innocent?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Completely," James said firmly. "But innocence, I've learned, is sometimes less important than the appearance of innocence. I'm returning to India because it is a place where I can attempt to live with some measure of peace. I am returning because I believe that my presence here serves no useful purpose and only prolongs the village's discomfort." "And what of Margaret?" Miss Marple asked. "Do you believe justice has been served in her death?" James considered this carefully. "I believe that Catherine Hartwell is being punished for her actions in a manner consistent with the law and with the circumstances of her crime. I believe that Margaret would have preferred that no one be punished, that the entire matter be left to rest. But I also believe that Catherine's punishment serves a purpose. It acknowledges that Margaret's life had value, that her death was a tragedy that could not simply be ignored or forgotten." After James had departed, leaving behind him an air of melancholy resignation, Miss Marple sat alone in her sitting room and reflected upon the events that had unfolded since that golden afternoon of the garden party. She thought about the nature of secrets and how they accumulated within families like sediment in still water, building layers of deception and moral compromise until the weight of those layers became unbearable. She thought about Margaret Ashton, a woman whom she had never truly known, who had lived at the margins of Little Ashford for 5 years, invisible to most and understood by none. Margaret had come seeking truth and had found it, only to discover that truth was less valuable than she had anticipated, that understanding why one had been wronged was not the same as being made whole again. She thought about Catherine, whose idealism had collided so catastrophically with the complexity of the actual world. Catherine had believed that exposing injustice would somehow make amends for it, would transform Margaret's suffering into something meaningful. Instead, Catherine had created only additional suffering, had added her own burden of guilt and regret to the accumulating weight of family dysfunction. And she thought about Eleanor, a woman who had been forced to confront the reality that the man she had loved and respected had been capable of considerable moral compromise, and that she herself bore some responsibility for maintaining the systems that had allowed such compromise to flourish unchallenged. It was in this state of reflective quietude that Miss Marple made a decision that would occupy her for the next several months. She began, with great care and deliberation, to document the events of the murder investigation. She did not do this for publication or for any external audience. She wrote it as a record, a way of ensuring that the truth about what had happened, including the complexities and contradictions that had characterized the investigation, would be preserved for her own understanding and for posterity. As she wrote, she found herself reflecting upon the nature of detective work, upon what it meant to pursue truth when truth was often far more complicated and far less satisfying than the neat conclusions one might construct for public consumption. She reflected upon the distinction between solving a crime and understanding it, between identifying who had committed an act and understanding why that person had felt compelled to do so. By winter, as the first snow began to fall upon Little Ashford, the investigation had been formally closed. Catherine remained in prison, serving her sentence with a quiet dignity that suggested she had achieved some measure of acceptance regarding her fate. Eleanor had begun the slow process of restructuring her life in the absence of Catherine's presence. David had returned to London, where he continued his business interests with undiminished enthusiasm, seemingly possessed of the remarkable ability to compartmentalize the tragedy and move forward without being burdened by its weight. And in the village, life gradually returned to its ordinary rhythms. The scandal faded from local conversation, replaced by the ordinary concerns of daily existence, the state of the harvest, the vicar's plans for the Christmas festival, speculation about Mrs. Weatherby's plans for her late husband's estate. Within a year, new scandals had emerged to displace the Hartwell murder from the village's collective consciousness, and within 2 years it had become the sort of story that people referenced as historical precedent rather than as recent trauma. Miss Marple, however, never entirely forgot. She maintained correspondence with Eleanor, receiving occasional letters that documented the older woman's gradual adjustment to her changed circumstances. She received word that Catherine had been assigned to prison work that suited her talents for organization and design. She learned that James had indeed found peace in India and had become respected in his academic position. She heard that David had begun to experience financial difficulties, that his business ventures were not proving as profitable as he had anticipated, and that his charm was gradually losing its power to deflect the consequences of his own poor judgment. On a spring afternoon, nearly 3 years after the murder, as Miss Marple was sitting in her garden observing the new growth of flowers emerging from the earth after winter's dormancy, she found herself thinking about the nature of justice and closure. The case had been solved, the guilty party had been identified and punished, yet nothing had been truly resolved. Margaret remained dead. Catherine remained imprisoned. Eleanor remained bereaved of her daughter. The family remained fractured and diminished, and yet, as Miss Marple observed the flowers pushing through the soil with their persistent determination, she understood that life moved forward whether justice was achieved or not, that time was the great corrector, and that eventually all wounds, no matter how deep, began their slow process of healing. The scar would remain, visible and permanent, but the acute pain would fade, and what had seemed catastrophic would gradually assume its place in the continuum of human experience as simply another chapter in the complex and often tragic story of human existence. It was at this moment that Miss Marple made her final observation regarding the affair of the murdered woman in the conservatory. She understood, with the clarity that came only with time and distance, that this was precisely the nature of true detective work. Not the dramatic revelation of the guilty party, but the gradual understanding of the circumstances that had led to the crime, the recognition of all the small failures and compromises that had accumulated until violence became inevitable. The door of Ashford Hall, which had been pressed so gently shut on that afternoon of the garden party, had been opened to reveal all the accumulated shadows within. And while the confrontation with those shadows had been painful and tragic, it had also been necessary. It had revealed that even in a small English village, in a house of apparent respectability and order, the fundamental human vulnerabilities, the capacity for deception, the fragility of moral certainty, the collision between idealism and reality, remained eternally present, waiting only for circumstances to draw them out into the light. As the seasons continued their eternal rotation and little Ashford gradually returned to what it had once been, Miss Marple sat in her garden and reflected that this, finally, was what she had learned from a lifetime of observing human nature. Evil was not often the product of calculated malice, but rather the result of small compromises, accumulated resentments, and the desperate attempts of flawed people to make meaning from circumstances they could not control. Justice, when it came, was not the dramatic triumph of good over evil, but rather the slow, painful recognition of complexity and the acceptance that closure, true closure, was something one carried within oneself, rather than something the world could provide. The case was closed, filed away in the records of Scotland Yard and the county courts. But for those who had lived through it, who had been transformed by it, the investigation continued in perpetuity, a quiet, internal examination of conscience and consequence that would occupy them in various forms for the remainder of their lives. And that, Miss Marple understood, was precisely as it should be. For to have not been changed by such events would have been a failure far more profound than any inability to solve a murder.